All right. Well, to kick us off today, I just want to say thank you all for joining us for our second virtual lecture series for OCD Massachusetts. My name is Nathaniel Van Kirk. I'm the Vice President of OCD Massachusetts, and it's my pleasure today to have Dr. Jason Krompinger with me to talk a little bit about dealing with rumination and repetitive negative thinking. And I've had the privilege to know Jason for many years. Jason was actually my supervisor when I first started at the OCDI. Got to put up with me for a number of years. Taught me many things that I know.
It was my greatest pleasure.
Oh, well, thank you. Since we're recording, I feel like you have to say that, but I appreciate it anyway. Well, so currently, Jason Krompinger is the Director of Psychological Services and Clinical Research at the OCD Institute, as well as working in private practice with OCD and anxiety disorders. Prior to his current position of overseer of the world and all things OCD, so Jason did his undergraduate at Notre Dame, as we were just talking about getting ready for the big showdown between our alma maters of Notre Dame, Virginia Tech. So looking forward to that showdown, at least as long as we win. Otherwise, I'm going to hide from you at work the next day. But then after that, you did your PhD at the University of Delaware and came to McLean as an intern and postdoc, correct? And then continued to stay on and now supervise all the new interns, postdocs.
Never left. I did not leave. I just said, I'm not, sorry. I don't want to move again. So they couldn't get rid of me.
That's a fair reason.
Yeah.
And so for today, what I'm going to do is kick it over to Jason to do a little bit of an overview, kind of set the stage for us. And then, as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat below. And then as Jason's going through his presentation, I know he also wants to make sure we have plenty of time for a Q&A. And so then I'll hop back in and kind of facilitate a Q&A so we can get all your questions answered. And so with that, thank you so much for joining us, Jason. And I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to you.
Cool. Thank you so much. I really appreciate everybody being here. This is always a privilege to be able to do this, particularly for OCD Massachusetts. So thanks, Nathaniel. So I'm going to just share my little slides here. So like Nathaniel said, I'm going to try to not spend a lot. Oh gosh, the little the bar there is covering up my thing. A ton of time on slides right now because I want to get to the questions. So. But I just wanted to do a little bit of work up front here to lay the groundwork for what it is that we're talking about. So I had this title, The Lurking Saboteur, referring to the ruminative response style. And just to say a little bit about that as it relates to OCD. And yeah, just a little note here. I'm going to get into some case examples, but they're thoroughly de-identified and anonymized. So there won't be any identifying information of any sort. Some of these case examples are sort of composites of people, but nothing identifying. But in order to talk about rumination and OCD, I have to say a couple of things first. Nathaniel sort of touched on my training a little bit. So this is a picture of 3535 Market Street in Philadelphia. And this is where I actually did a lot of my training, my just initial training on treating OCD. It was at the Center for Treatment and Study of Anxiety at UPenn. I was a grad student at University of Delaware. I did a clinical externship, practicum there. And that's where I learned that exposure therapy is really impressive. Like exposure therapy is super cool. It really, and when people engage with it, when you as a clinician can help somebody join with and connect to the principles of exposure, it's an impressive intervention that can really change lives. And it's been a privilege to be part of that in my career. And then I got to the OCDI. Now, sadly, gosh, I need to update the slide. This is actually not a picture of the OCDI anymore. We've physically moved buildings in the last, during the pandemic, we switched to a different building. So this is the old building, still a nice building, North Belknap, but we're in a different one on campus. When I got to McLean for my postdoc, what I found was that still ERP, exposure therapy, is impressive, but OCD is impressive. The disorder is impressive in terms of how it sort of bends and twists and morphs in accordance with whatever is kind of being thrown at it. And I think that's what I think about a lot when we think about rumination is like, how is it sort of showing up as a means of undermining what we're trying to do, what the sufferer, what the patient, what their clinician is trying to do in exposure therapy. In the ways it can sort of adjust itself are sort of almost impressive, kind of in a way. So I like to just, I use that term saboteur. I think I don't have these kind of funny little posters, like a movie poster there, and like from an old video game. Just the saboteur is kind of just lurking in the shadows somewhere. That if we don't turn our attention to this process and shine a light on it and root it out and sort of address it, then treatment can be slow, or treatment can be hampered, or even sort of like stopped in its tracks with some folks. So I think in the past few years, more and more people talk about rumination as it unfolds in OCD, but I just want, the point of this talk is to, again, to focus on that process and discuss what it is and talk about how it can show up in different case examples. So what are we talking about? First, I have to say what we're not talking about. So sometimes historically, even in certain measures of OCD, there's this conflation between rumination and intrusive thoughts. So when I say rumination, I'm not talking about thoughts that kind of pop up out of the blue that you had no control over whether they showed up. They just sort of occurred to you. Distressing, intrusive, violent, blasphemous, whatever the case might be, all the kind of classic OCD symptoms. Rumination is not the same thing as intrusive thoughts. I'll talk more about what it is in a second, but just to be clear, we're also not talking about mental rituals per se. So in a minute, I'll say a little bit more about what I'm talking about here, what I kind of mean by that, but I want to distinguish between rumination and mental rituals. So these are like thought neutralization strategies, self-reassurance, mental review, all that sort of thing. Those kind of clear efforts that people make to try to eliminate difficult thoughts or difficult experiences. The rumination is kind of it can, as we'll discuss, it can kind of unfold and function similarly. But there's some important key distinctions that I want to make. So rumination is not the same thing as mental rituals. So I just want to kind of say that at the jump here. What is it then? So when I was in grad school, I loved Susan Nolan Hoeksema's work. I was actually really into depression, and she did a lot of kind of groundbreaking work on gender differences in depression, but specifically rumination and depression as well. She actually tragically passed away very young. It was about 10 years ago or so. But she's a Yale professor. She defined rumination as a mode of responding to distress. So I think it's a key word here, is that rumination is a response to distress, or in OCD, a response to symptoms, a response to an intrusive thought, a response to an unwanted experience, an unwanted image, an unwanted memory or sensation. But it's a mode of responding that involves repetitively and passively focusing on the symptoms and the possible causes and consequences. So Nolan Hoeksema's definition here, like I said, is relevant to, she was talking about depression, but I think that this is a process, is indeed very transdiagnostic, and can absolutely show up in OCD as well. So it's a way of responding to symptoms. So it's sort of like, I have an intrusive thought about bringing harm to my mom. Why am I having that thought? What's wrong with me that I have that thought? What does it mean about me that I have that thought? That's kind of the thing that we're talking about today, that process. So further just defining it, it's a style of thinking. It's kind of a way of thinking. It's cyclical. It just kind of goes around and around and around in circles. It's repetitive. It kind of just keeps occurring. Critically, it doesn't get you anywhere. It's sort of, as we'll talk about later, it serves some function. It holds a promise of being productive. It sort of like masquerades as being productive in some way, but rumination never is by definition. It's something that historically can predict the onset and course of major depression. A lot of people talk about rumination in terms of it being focused on the past. I think it can really be anything. It could be the future, it could be the present, it could be all different, kind of span the gamut of time. Associated with decreased goal-oriented actions, it really kind of sucks your resources. It makes you worse at completing goals, can't solve problems, even though sometimes it's aimed at problem solving. It's associated with decreases in social support. So a lot of times people who struggle with rumination can do it out loud a lot, kind of with friends and family. And frankly, friends and family can really try to be supportive and helpful, but it can really sort of deplete their resources as well, sort of hear this stuff over and over again on what the sufferer is going through. So it's associated with decreases in social support. SAP's executive function. So again, your kind of capacity to sort of maintain your attention on a task, to filter out distracting stimuli, etc. So for OCD, we're going to sort of broaden this definition a bit. So again, historically, rumination has been investigated as a depressive phenomenon, but certainly applies to OCD and all kinds of other disorders as well. So when we talk about rumination and OCD, we're talking about ruminating on OCD symptoms, on inner experiences, but also just things like, how am I doing in treatments? You know, is this working for me? Am I getting better, et cetera? There's all kinds of things that one can ruminate on. The human brain is quite, you know, another impressive thing. So just to like lump everything together here, we're also talking about stuff like worry. So I've just said the word rumination a lot. I'll kind of probably use that as sort of a kind of the word that I go with for this talk. But we're also talking about things like, if you're wondering about worrying, if you're worrying about things like negative self-talk, self-punishment, post-event processing, which is this phenomenon that you see often in social anxiety disorder, where you'll have an interaction with, so people who suffer from social anxiety can have an interaction with somebody socially, a social interaction, and then afterwards review that event over and over again in their heads. I think I'm talking about that kind of stuff too, for sure. But certainly worry as far as just the what ifs, kind of like, a what if this happens? What if that happens? What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? That I think is lumped into this conversation here as an important process, an important thinking style for us as clinicians to be paying attention to, certainly for those of you that suffer from OCD, to pay attention to these processes. Negative self-talk, so just, you know, kind of criticizing yourself, punishing yourself, flagellating. I call it self-flagellation, kind of like, you know, really hammering on yourself, especially in the wake of making mistakes, or, you know, potentially in the wake of having really terrifying or very sort of like guilt-inducing intrusive thoughts. Self-punishment can be a ruminative sort of strategy that people kind of unwittingly stumble across or use. So we're talking about all that kind of stuff as well. So collectively, all these things are called repetitive negative thinking. So yeah, all these different processes, so rumination, worry, negative self-talk, self-punishment, post-event processing, they're all like topographically similar. They all kind of look the same. You know, they have some different specific features in terms of content, but they look the same. They perhaps function similarly. And we'll talk more about function in a second. We learned about them from studies of major depression and GAD. But again, transdiagnostic for sure. And I think I wrote this slide a couple of years ago, that relatively little research in RNT has been done in OCD. I think it's still kind of the case, although it's getting better in recent years for sure. So it's a mental behavior. It's a thing that we're doing. And I'm going to say we very deliberately, because this isn't something specific to people with OCD or mood or anxiety disorder. This is something that the general population, I think, like certainly struggles with. It's a behavior that unwittingly maintains OCD. So if we conceptualize it, then it's a response, as I've been saying, to distress. It must be reinforced. So doing that, what's wrong with me? What kind of person I am that I'm having these thoughts and feelings? What if this? What if that? It's all that all feels bad. Anybody who talks about their rumination or their worry or their negative self-talk, across the board, anybody I've ever spoken to about that knows, like, this is like not a fun thing that I'm doing, to put it simply. They don't want to be doing it, but they can't seem to resist doing it. And I always, you know, carry around this thought, and I'll just keep saying it until somebody proves me definitively wrong, that we as human beings, we don't do any behavior. We engage in no behavior unless it's reinforced in some way, unless we get something out of it. That thing that we get out of it might not always be positive or happy or anything like that, but it's reinforced. So we have to understand, well, if the rumination, if the repetitive thinking, if we think of it as a behavior that we're doing in response to our distress, it must serve some function for us. So what's in it for the person that's doing it? With the case examples I'm going to give, I'm going to sort of illustrate some ways that repetitive negative thinking can function. So first, what I have to do, though, is talk about an example from my own life of kind of how this has worked. And it's just an excuse to show super cute pictures of my daughter, who's 9 now. So all of these are super old pictures. But it was an experience I had when she was just born, that my wife and I had when she was just born, that was kind of indicative of some of these processes happening. I'm going to sort of tell you a somewhat abbreviated version of the story here, and I'll leave these pictures up just so you can kind of ogle the pictures of her. It's weird to do this on Zoom because I don't know if people are reacting in any way, but that's fine. I'll just assume that everybody's just in awe of how cute she is. But so when she was about a day or two old, you know, we brought her to her pediatricians for the first appointment, And I remember watching the pediatrician go through all this like evaluation, just like, seeing how she was doing. And, it was kind of funny. They were like, she was like poking and prodding at her, and the pediatrician was like folding her up and stuff, like doing all kinds of weird things. That was kind of funny. But at one point she flipped her over on her stomach and was the pediatrician was pressing her thumb into her name's Maddie, my daughter, pressing her thumb into Maddie's back, like the top part of her, like the fatty top part of her back. And I remember watching her face, and her brow sort of furrowed a little bit. And the pediatrician said, "Oh yeah, it looks like she's a little jaundiced." And so like she was pressing her thumb against her skin and pulling her thumb away, and you'd see the thumbprint sort of remain for a moment, and then it would sort of fill in, and it would be kind of yellowy, sort of the skin. I don't remember all the specific details, but in the moment it was sort of like, oh gosh, well, what is that? What does that mean, that she's jaundiced? And there are all these different. Apparently, it's very common with infants to be jaundiced, have yellowed skin, maybe some of the yellowing in the eyes and stuff like that. So generally, it's harmless. But then the pediatrician was saying, well, it could be indicative of essentially a more serious issue. So we should get she should get a blood test done. And I remember, oh, gee, okay, just sort of feeling like worried about that. Just like, this pediatrician, I think, was, to her credit, to being educational and reassuring and all that and what she was saying. But it kind of sparked this kind of worry in me, and certainly my wife too, to some extent. She's less of a worrier than I am, but I don't know about that. But so I remember we brought her to get the blood test done. It was like a Friday or something like that. And to get the blood test, to get blood from an infant is kind of a sad thing. They have to prick their little foot and like have the blood drip out. But I remember that whole thing happened, and then we had to wait a couple of days before there was any response. And then it was during that time that I found that a lot of the worry kind of thoughts were happening. So I'm going to sort of like put up this description, this sort of like pictorial representation of what that might have looked like, kind of for me, how my repetitive negative thinking was sort of unfolding during this event over the course of these couple of days when it was happening. So, or when we were waiting for the results. So just to put it bluntly, there's a thought. I mean, I had all kinds of different worry thoughts that popped into my mind, but one of the thoughts was just she could die, right? So that this could be something really serious, and that this could be evidence that she has some terrible illness, and that she's not long for this world. So that pops into my mind. And the cycle can look like this. So that pops in. Then there's anxiety, there was sadness, there's some guilt, frustration, all kinds of stuff that could sort of show up in me that led to a bunch of different behaviors. So I remember over the course of the time between, and think about for yourself whether this happens for you, when there's something out there to worry about and it's not resolved, a bit of uncertainty that's out in the world, whether you're waiting for tests, like medical test results, or waiting for exam results, the academic test or something like that, or something else. Watch what you do. Because for me, it was like I disengaged kind of a little bit with the world. I wasn't kind of doing the stuff that I would normally do and avoid. These are some overt behaviors that I remember I was doing. I was like checking her a lot. I was like checking her. I was like taking her out of her crib and like, I don't know if my wife even knows this, but I was like poking and prodding at her to see if I could see the yellowing as well, kind of see how that was looking. Even though I'm not a pediatrician by any stretch. I was sort of like, I did this thing. I was like checking her breathing, checking other little symptoms that was going on. I was doing like looking online to see, researching what condition she could possibly have. Probably a little short, with my wife and with other people as well, from the bickering. But a lot of stuff in my head, like what if she's really sick? How are we going to manage this? Like, what do we do? Like, what do I do? What's wrong with me? What's wrong with my genes that like, that she would have, that she's not perfect. Why isn't she like, she's just a little kid. What did she do? She didn't ask for any of this. I was doing a lot of that stuff in my head that was kind of just creating this kind of misery. And certainly wasn't doing anything to quell these thoughts. The thoughts were still kind of going on strong, and I was kind of reacting in this particular way. So the question then becomes sort of like, what is the function of this? So just to like illustrate this a little bit more, this element here, this first part, this is the part that I couldn't control, and this is the part that you can't control. Like if you have thoughts in your mind that kick off the ruminative or the repetitive negative thinking, the initial intrusive thoughts and the emotions that show up later. That's part of being a human being. And then there's overt behavior. Then we're getting into things that maybe you can more control. So overt behavior just means like behavior that's observable, you can see. And then there's covert behavior. There's things that you're doing kind of in your head. With OCD, we're often with covert behavior, we're talking about mental rituals. But with repetitive negative thinking, again, just to repeat, we're categorizing this as a behavior, a mental behavior, a way of responding. So I'm engaging in that particular behavior in response to this distress. So why? The question is, why would I do that? And I don't want to kind of give it all away right now, but just in terms of this example, I remember there was this specific moment that I had when it was that weekend in between getting the blood test and getting the results, like the Monday, kind of getting the results. And I would say it was definitely March because my daughter was born in March. So it was March, and that's when college basketball is on. The NCAA tournament is on. And I remember I was watching a game, and I remember for a few moments, I caught myself being very into the game. Like I was like, I just don't remember the teams or anything like that, but I was into what I was watching, and I caught myself not worrying, not engaging in this repetitive negative thinking. So I just want you to think for a second then what maybe that was like for me to have that moment when here's my daughter, just born, just got this blood test to figure out what was going on with her. I don't know the results of it yet, been worried about it. And then I find that I'm not worried what my kind of emotional experience might have been. And I'll come back to it kind of at the end. So function, like why are we engaging in this behavior? How do they show up and how might they undermine treatment? So I love this. I just love Kelvin and Hobbes. And this is kind of an example of, I think I mentioned a little bit before, this idea of out loud rumination that can erode social support. And this is, I think, an example of that. Just kind of like going on, like, what is the point of any of this? And then Hobbes tries to be helpful. It's like, I don't know why I'm even talking to you. But again, the reason why I like this comic is because, Calvin is doing this. He's bringing it up for a reason. Our brains are bringing up these kind of opportunities to ruminate on these things for a reason. It's kind of a question of why exactly. Sorry about the abrupt change in theme here for the slide. I just pulled this from a different thought. Just to illustrate a little bit more this distinction. So intrusive thoughts, rather mental rituals versus rumination. This is kind of a weird little diagram, but this is a diagram of what I would say mental rituals look like. So we have this distressing thought enter our awareness, and then we engage in these efforts to deliberate efforts to eliminate those thoughts. So I mentioned them already before, but thought replacement, thought neutralization strategies, thinking a positive thought instead, self-reassurance, mantras, that sort of thing. These are things that for people with OCD, a lot of people with OCD have these particular symptoms. They're engaging in that mental behavior for the express purpose of addressing this thought. With rumination, with repetitive negative thinking, same kind of like thing unfolds where you have the distressing thought enter your awareness and you start engaging in, but it's not, very few people say, I'm doing this so as to eliminate this thought. Sometimes you can kind of get to that, but oftentimes it's sort of like, I don't really know why I'm doing it. And also a lot of people will say, I mean, maybe even some of you are saying, hear me talk about this. I don't know that I have control over my rumination and worries. It doesn't sort of feel like it. And then if you kind of think about it a little more, maybe you do, but the perception of volition, that's what perception of volition means. So like the idea that you actually have control over this, it's more clear with mental rituals. A lot of, like most patients I would talk to would say, yes, no, I choose to engage in this because I just feel like I have to. But with the rumination, the repetitive negative thinking, the volition feels less so, and the function is less clear too. All right, so can give us some case examples. Again, thoroughly de-identified here. I'm going to try to decide which that I want to do because I want to get to questions. So we'll start with Diane. Again, I'll just throw out some demographics, but this is not really, again, aren't really representative necessarily of the case, but just picture a college student, long history of OCD, lots of different symptoms, lots of different trials of ERP. ERP has failed her in a number of different ways, comorbid depression, been hospitalized because of suicidal ideation. So just as far as her OCD, just in a snapshot, the core symptoms, the obsessions are intrusive thoughts having to do with bad things happening to her mom and her family. So let's just say that. She's like, I have these bad thoughts that bad stuff's going to happen to my family, just broadly speaking. So what she does is just generally avoid any contact with those that she cares about. Let's just say that. And then also a lot of mental rituals to prevent that from happening. A lot of what I was just saying before, like thought replacement, neutralization, that sort of thing. So she's doing just, I'll give a super short kind of representation of what Diane's exposure plan might be. So her exposure might be then is, I'm not going to go over the basics of ERP because I feel like people who go to this lecture tend to know these, but I'm sorry. So, there are plenty of opportunities to learn more about ERP and other venues. So I'm sorry if this misses you a little bit, but let's say her exposure plan, or a plan where she's trying to face her fears and resist doing the rituals. She's going to deliberately do things in her mind to put her family in harm's way. So like have a thought about someone she cares about, and then have a negative thought, have a thought about harm coming to them. Like that just could be an exposure for this person. Resist the overt physical rituals, like the avoidance, resist the mentally undoing and neutralizing and all that kind of stuff. It's a standard exposure you might see for someone like that. And what I'm going to do is share, this is somebody who, we worked with, this is a long time ago, but I'm going to share what a note, what a session note, or rather this is a shift note from our counseling staff, what it could look like. Again, this of course isn't an actual note, but this is what it could look like as far as a representation of what Diane was doing in between exposures. So she would do her exposure. She'd try to deliberately have these thoughts and try to resist these mental rituals as much as she could. And she kind of did that. She was engaging in treatment. But this is what it looked like in between her exposures. So this is kind of just like a description of a day where she was med and group compliant. She appeared to be stuck during TXP as treatment planning. It's a group. When asked how she was doing today and after group, she said not too good. She had a terrible day yesterday. She was stuck for the first half of hour of ERP due to emotions she was experiencing about her life, and she doesn't see the point of trying anymore. She did a contract for safety and said she would and was capable of telling staff if she wasn't. She's really kind of not in a good way right now after having done exposures, and she's saying what's the point? And that's kind of a good hallmark of, I think, ruminative thinking, is kind of the nihilism, what's the point of life and all that sort of stuff. The interesting thing is if you look at yesterday, so just bear in mind, she said she had a terrible day yesterday, right? These are just made up dates, but let's just say it's July 24th. But then you look at July 23rd, the day before, appeared baseline in behavior. So this is during the day. Everything seemed kind of fine. And then at night, she went to groups, she took her meds, she signed out for a while. She said she had a good time. She asked about checking in, but never did. She overall appeared in bright spirits throughout the shift. So again, she said she had a terrible day yesterday on this day. And then if you look at least outwardly, she's saying she had a good time and appeared to be in bright spirits. This is not somebody who would necessarily appear to be in bright spirits if they weren't actually in bright spirits. So what was actually going on here? The way that I think about this is that when people are making all these efforts to engage in exposures, particularly in exposures around thoughts that feel very repugnant to them, whether in this case it's thoughts about harm coming to family. This happens a lot in pedophilia-focused OCD, where it's you're having these thoughts of being sexually attracted to kids, and you find that so upsetting and revolting that you would have those kinds of thoughts, or you feel like maybe you have some kind of arousal around those thoughts, and that gives you its own kind of set of distress. In treatment, what can happen is that people try to adhere. They do their exposures. They deliberately have the thoughts. They try to resist their rituals. But then the rumination serves as to sort of replace the ritual in a way. And I think this little Charlie Brown comic represents the concept that I'm talking about here. So it's I'm going to intentionally be in this depressed stance, because if I'm not in this depressed stance and I put my head up and I feel better, that's no good. So just think about it like this. This is the case for this person, Diane. She did her exposures on the 23rd. She deliberately allowed herself to have these thoughts. She deliberately resisted these mental rituals, and had a good day. At some point, what happened is she felt incredibly guilty for having a good day in the wake of doing that exposure, if that makes sense. So it's I let myself have these thoughts. I didn't do all the things that I would normally do to try to get rid of these thoughts. And now I feel horribly guilty about it. Thus kicks off the rumination. So she begins ruminating about nothing matters. What's the point? I'm terrible. The world is terrible. Life is terrible. And that the function of it in that case is to manage that guilt that she's experiencing. So it's sort of like the only thing worse than doing wrong is doing wrong and not feeling sufficiently badly about it. I see this all the time in folks who have these kinds of, again, particularly the unacceptable thoughts domain of OCD symptoms. So the function of the rumination is to ward off the guilt. Now, while the person's doing it, they feel miserable. They might even feel, the direction of suicidal. But that's a preferable experience. It's a weird thing to say out loud, but that's a preferable experience than having the intrusive thoughts and just shrugging them and just not ritualizing and moving on. So that is an important function of rumination that you see a lot can operate to ward off that guilt. So as far as intervention goes, you'll hear me I'll just say this often when I talk about how to deal with rumination. I love ACT approaches as a way of developing a way of navigating rumination and really just kind of cognitive behaviors in general. I think it gives us good language around practicing looking at thoughts, viewing thoughts as thoughts, noticing hooks. So a metaphor that I'll often use that I didn't make up for sure, but that ACT kind of provides, that is a great metaphor for distinguishing between having intrusive thoughts and engaging in rumination, is a simple hook and fish metaphor. So the hooks are the thoughts, so a fish swimming around in a pond can't control the fact that there are fisher people, with their hooks in the pond, trying to get them. Like that's just part of being a fish, I guess. So just like being a human being means that you're going to have hooks. You're going to have these thoughts enter your mind, enter your awareness that you'd rather not have. You can decide the extent to which you bite into those hooks and engage with all that, and practice noticing when you're engaged, when you're bitten into those hooks, and taking that step back and back to observation mode. So there's a whole, I think that, I saw the OCD lecture schedule, and I think at some point later on, we'll have speakers talk about ACT. So that's a whole talk in and of itself, but ACT-based interventions, I think, are very useful. Exposure, in terms of exposure stuff, for this person, for Diane, these exposures around self-indulgence. A word I'll often use is you have to increase your carbon footprint. And actually, I should change this because enough patients I work with don't like that, just because carbon footprint has such a negative connotation, where they want to, and somebody gave me a much better way of putting it, which is existential footprint. So increasing your existential footprint. So this idea that for this patient that I'm talking about as example, if she were to do her exposures and then deliberately go have fun. It sounded like she had fun this day just kind of by accident. But go do stuff that's kind of feels self-indulgent, feels like good for you. And that's the kind of way to sort of practice having a different response to those thoughts that's different than rumination, that's different than just isolating yourself in your room and kind of being stuck in your head. Also just other overt things like, call your mom right after your exposure and be happy, just act like, things are good. Big exposure, because your brain just wants you to go into that ruminative space and avoid. So again, just in this case, rumination of serving to function as a means of avoiding an unwanted inner experience, but easy to miss, I think. So this, I'm gonna decide which one I want to do. Yeah, I'll do this one. I'll do this one next, and then we'll do this one. And then I'm gonna break for a question. We'll see how long this takes. Here's another patient again. Just this is not actually the demographics, but Brian. Just imagine a single guy, long history of OCD and depression, lots of psychiatric hospitalizations, including a couple of suicide attempts. So really, really severely ill and suffering quite a bit. So this is somebody who has OCD around fear of being a pedophile, and so thoughts that perhaps they're attracted to kids, and particularly kids that. And this person was afraid of being attracted to kids in their family. So in terms of compulsions, a lot of reassurance seeking, he would blur his vision on purpose to try to not be looking at kids in any particular sexual way, and a lot of avoidance around being around kids. So here's an example of just kind of a really somewhat sanitized version of what an exposure script could look like. So. And this is, again, if you don't know, an exposure script is where you would deliberately write out all your kind of deep, dark fears and practice coming into contact with them willingly.
So he might have an exposure that looks like this. I'm playing with my niece, I become aroused, I feel the excitement building as her gaze meets mine, she sits on my lap, I'm becoming more and more aroused, start touching her, she doesn't resist, I'm truly am becoming aroused now. This shows that I'm a pedophile, a child molester, a monster, I'm a pedophile, I'm a pedophile. And you kind of take a glance at that and be like, okay, yeah, that seems really hard to say. That seems really distressing, acknowledging that he's a pedophile. And sometimes we'll do this in script where we'll even say like, I'm a murderer, I'm a monster. It just kind of depends on the person. You could look at this and say, yeah, that in a nutshell, that looks like a good quote unquote exposure script that would be effective at certainly bringing about the person's distress and providing them an opportunity to resist doing their rituals, because it would kind of generate urges to do those rituals. What happened a lot after exposure, though, is a ton of ruminating. So this is kind of what the out loud version of it would look like for this guy, Brian. But like, I'm a pedophile. Like, God, I am. What do I do? There's no way I can move on. There's no way I could be around my nieces ever again. I can't live like this. I'm disgusting. I'm a monster. So a lot of that kind of like self-talk going on. Again, bear in mind, he wasn't doing his rituals. He wasn't blurring his vision. He wasn't seeking reassurance he wasn't like trying to get me or anybody else to say that he wasn't. He was just kind of doing this all kind of happening in his head. A lot of this, I'm quoting this, but a lot of this was just stuff that he was kind of doing covertly, kind of in his mind. So he was resisting on paper. He was engaging in ERP. He was doing the treatment. Then we looked at, okay, what's the function of that? What is that doing for you that he would engage in this kind of this narrative in the wake of exposures? Bunch of things. So one thing, it kind of distracted. To do that, it's better to do the oh my God, what do I do, than actually face reality, or sort of like, it's not reality, but sort of face the thoughts head on. So you just think of it, you can really boil down a lot of what I'm saying in this kind of example, where if you imagine somebody you really care, just right now, for those of you that are watching, imagine somebody that you really care about. And, I'll just say my mom right now, just say, there's a big difference between what if my mom dies and my mom dies, like that, just those two phrases side by side, they're both kind of distressing. The what if kind of like promotes some like, okay, I'm going to do something here. I'm sort of like keeping the brunt of it at bay while I spring into action, so to speak. That my mom dies is more, that's more just kind of hits, right? That's the exposure. Like that's more that thought that we need to face. But the rumination, the repetitive negative thinking stuff, the worry, all that sort of stuff kind of serves as this way of keeping things a little bit at arm's length. And I think that's what was happening here with this process, with this patient. He would talk about the extent that rumination, in the way that I just described it, would generate feelings of depression. So the more he would do all that stuff, the sadder he felt, kind of the more stuck he felt, the more just like down on himself, down in his situation he felt. And that was reassuring to him. Again, he wasn't necessarily seeking it, but he was finding, this is more like when, in clinical conversations, we shined a light on this stuff. He would say, yeah, I feel a comfort in my sadness, because if I have these thoughts and I'm sufficiently sad, well, that's good. Like, or if I'm really a pedophile, at least I'm sufficiently feeling crappy about it and feeling badly about myself. The only thing worse than acknowledging that you're a pedophile, having these thoughts, is kind of shrugging your shoulders and moving on again. So the depression kind of serves as a way of reassuring. It's like the other example, kind of can serve to ward off guilt. This idea of being right versus happy. So a lot of times in rumination, what's happening is, especially if for people that have struggled with symptoms, with OCD symptoms for a long time, the more you ruminate on the presence of your symptoms, the more you are sort of making this case that you should give up, if that makes any sense. Sort of like, yeah, see how hopeless it is, see how I'll never be free of these thoughts. A lot of people who ruminate on treatment the rumination can function this way, where it's sort of like, hey man, just give up, because like nothing's going to go right for you. Like look at all the different ways in which your life is so hard and that things are so terrible for you. And it creates this sense of justification for sort of withdrawing from the world. It feels better to be right, quote unquote, and say like, yeah, see, I thought things were hopeless. when I ruminate, I reflect on all the ways that it's hopeless. So I'm quote unquote right. And that can feel better than I say being happy, which is, maybe all that stuff is true, or maybe all that stuff exists, but you can move on anyway. You don't have to sit here and stay and stew on this. You can take this approach of recognizing it, doing treatment, moving on, not ruminating, or practicing resisting rumination, moving on, and potentially having a better life. There's something that feels wrong about that, especially if you spent years trying to create this case that things are hopeless. To sort of shine this light on this idea that things might not be hopeless feels bad, I think, for a lot of people, and it can feel, on some level, maybe clinicians think like, oh, this should be a good thing, but it's not. It creates a lot of, I think, grief and regret. So with Brian, he was doing a lot of repetitive focus on his symptoms because it just created this case that he was right, that things were hopeless and that he shouldn't move on, which, of course, as I said at the beginning, resulted in a lot of suicidal ideation and hospitalizations on his case. So in terms of intervention, in this case, you've got to pay a lot of careful attention to the language of the script. So going back to the script, I wouldn't want him saying, I'm a pedophile, I'm a monster. He could say, I might be, there's a chance that I am. But when he says it that way, that I am one, he's kind of giving him this kind of permission to just go ahead and ruminate about it. It's actually more distressing for him to just sit in this kind of like this purgatorial spot, where it's like, well, maybe I am, maybe I'm not. I'd want him to do that sort of thing. Pleasurable activities. So same kind of thing is going on with the other Diane case. Just engage in more useful behaviors, more behaviors that are pleasurable, that are on the surface, things that are fun, that one wants to be able to do. To sort of, again, promote this idea that, no, you're going to respond differently to these experiences. We're not, a lot of times with repetitive negative thinking, yes, it's a behavior that's happening covertly in people's heads, but you can, oftentimes people are doing behaviors to sort of set the stage for rumination worries. So like they'll isolate a lot. You'll just kind of sit in it. I have a lot of patients who have like a rumination chair. Like I just sit there, and they don't necessarily sit there with the intention of ruminating, but if they're sitting in that chair, they're going to be ruminating. So very much like just inactive, like non-activating behaviors. So integrating activating behaviors, sure. And then again, cognitive refusion, being more aware of the hooks, being more aware of just kind of, I'm going to bring it back real quick to this loop here, being more aware of this sort of stuff that shows up and developing a different way of response, where if my normal response style is to do all this stuff to set the stage for a lot of this stuff, I'm going to recognize it and allow for those thoughts and then allow for those inner experiences, but I'm going to do things differently. And you find that the more that people engage in different, even overt behaviors, again, like doing activating behaviors in response to these kinds of thoughts, it makes it harder to do this sort of thing. If you're actively engaging in something meaningful, it can sort of begin to disrupt this process. But it's very much it takes a lot of practice. A lot of people have been doing these sorts of things this repetitive thinking for a long time. It's just kind of well-worn territory. And in terms of treatment, it takes a lot of deliberate practice to sort of break out of those patterns and do things differently. So actually, I'm seeing that that's quarter up. I want to stop. Yeah, I want to kind of stop there and just hear any comments or questions or anything I could do to kind of further elucidate this.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Jason. Yeah. I think that actually kind of where you ended on this last slide also kind of dovetails nicely with one of the questions that came through about differentiating between negative automatic thoughts.
Totally. Yeah.
And kind of this negative repetitive thinking process. Yeah. I was wondering if you could comment kind of briefly. I think you had this is a really good description of that, of how those two might be related, but still slightly different.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the automatic thoughts, I think of those as like, that's beyond our control. Like those are things that are entering our awareness, whether we like them or not. I can't, these double negatives, like I can't not have the thought Maddie could die, I sure will try if you have OCD, but you can't. Just say I can't resist, I can't have the experience that shows up as a result of that. So that's this like kind of thing that's happening outside of my awareness, or not outside of my awareness, but outside of my control. The extent to which I respond to those thoughts by engaging in something, by engaging in a process, a thinking process that has a function, that has an intended function, that's where it gets into the repetitive negative thinking. So in these examples I gave, these patients were engaging in that
for the purposes of warding off guilt, for the purposes of reassuring in some sense, for the purposes of creating this case that things are hopeless. It's more of an active process than the automatic thoughts. But just to be clear, there aren't bright lines between the automatic thoughts and the rumination. So a big chunk of treatment, especially early on in treatment, is just distinguishing for yourself. Working with your clinician to distinguish, okay, what's outside my awareness, what's just happening, and what am I, and where's the part where I bite into the hook, to go with that metaphor.
Well, I think this brings up another question that came through was kind of a little bit of confusion in terms of that line. And I know, like, kind of you and I've talked a little bit about it. That's a fairly fine line at times between kind of rumination, where it's that there is that response to it, but isn't necessarily like a ritualistic response, versus what is a mental ritual. So when would you say where rumination may cross that line into like ritualistic rumination or a mental ritual and kind of change function in that sense?
Yeah, just to be try to make that clear. So with mental rituals, I think what's happening is that it's people have an intrusive thought, and the mental ritual is a cognitive behavior that the person is literally telling you, I do this to get rid of that thought or to get rid of that feeling. So I have this thought that I don't like, and I replace that thought with a positive. Like that is a mental ritual. I have this thought that I don't like about something bad that could have happened. I mentally go through, I review everything that I did that day to try to figure out whether or not I caused harm somehow. You ask a person with OCD can sit there and tell you, no, I'm doing that, and B, I'm doing that for this purpose. Okay, so that's to me what a mental ritual is. Rumination doesn't always show up that way. Sometimes, so you're asking about like rumination as a ritual. Sometimes there are people that can say, I am ruminating on my thought because I'm trying to solve something, because I'm trying to get an answer. In that case, it's a little clearer. Like, yeah, that's functioning very much as a ritual for you. You're trying to reduce uncertainty. You're trying to eliminate the anxiety around it. You know what I mean? But I just want to be clear, because I think sometimes people can hear my talk and be like, I don't know that I don't know that I have a sense of control over rumination. I don't really know why I'm doing it. There are plenty of people that are in that boat too. And again, this is where our role, I think, as a clinician, is to help people sort of identify that and kind of understand, like, okay, so here's that line where it's kind of crossing over into something that's volitional.
Well, I think that in a way, one of the ways that I've thought about this, and one of another question that came up, I'm kind of combine a few because we have a number of questions. Comes to like the control rumination. Can we control rumination in mental rituals? And then how might that change the picture for if someone is also struggling with something like a trauma history, where there's rumination needs like a sense of safety.
Yeah.
And what I know in the trauma kind of literature, we've talked a lot about this piece of rituals being from safety behaviors as being about like the how. That in OCD, the rituals are very much focused on like the how things are done, or how the thoughts are conducted, or how the ritual goes, versus like necessarily the outcome. The how doesn't matter as much. It's more I'm seeking this feeling. Would you say something similar kind of comes up when it comes to rumination versus mental ritual? That the rituals are more focused on the how versus.
How? Just say, but how? Like, how did this happen?
More like the process of the mental ritual. So like, I need to think about this way, or I need to think this type of thought in order to make this go away. But if I don't do it right, then this won't go away.
Yeah, absolutely. That can show up that way for sure with people that are ruminating. They have to sort of navigate it a particular way. I think that in a lot of cases, though, it's not necessarily adhering to rules like that. But I do think it can look more just sort of like all over the place and just sort of like a morass, kind of like, I don't know, I'm thinking about how terrible I am. I'm thinking about why I have these symptoms in the first place. I'm thinking about what could I do to prevent this in the future? All kinds of things that aren't necessarily adhering to like a strict sort of a rule set to follow. But OCD is nothing if not rigid, right? So I think that absolutely I've seen cases where it is this kind of like, I need to be sort of like, you don't get it. I need to like, shut up. I need to think about this in exactly the right way so as to resolve it. And yeah, that's where to me, it's more clearly like functioning as a ritual. The trauma stuff for sure. Yeah, I didn't mention that as just, I was kind of listening to I was talking about post-event processing in social anxiety, but yeah, there's tons of rumination in PTSD. And actually how I even got into this stuff with OCD in the first place was when I was at Penn. I would participate in a group I was trained on prolonged exposure for trauma and for PTSD, and was involved in group supervisions with Edna Foa, who created the protocol for that. And we had patients there where they were doing a ton of exposure to their trauma
imagery. If you're not familiar, that's kind of it's one of the major empirically based treatments for trauma is to actually do exposure around it and deliberately have the thought. And just a note on that, it's not to sort of like, it's not, you're not doing that to learn that the trauma wasn't a big deal or anything like that. You're doing that to learn that when you remember it, it's not like it's happening. It's not happening again. It's literally not, it's not actually occurring, even though it can feel like that for people with PTSD. But we had people who weren't making progress, and we were finding that the reason why some people weren't making progress is they're doing all this rumination, this kind of like this way of kind of staving off the brunt of the emotional experience. And it was only when they started to drop that and say, no, I'm going to just confront that. I'm going to just have this thought. I'm not going to do the what if thing. I'm not going to try to puzzle through it. I'm not going to try to solve anything. I'm not going to beat myself up for being in that situation in the first place. All the stuff, all the trauma types of cognitive distortions that people have. I'm just going to face it. That's when they could actually make progress.
Well, I think with that, there's a couple things that have come up. So I'm going to run through real quickly and kind of almost like rapid fire to get through a few of these just so we can get everybody's. One of the questions was about anger and kind of like getting angry at someone letting you down and how it might relate to rumination. And and do you have a quick kind of response on that one and that connection?
Well, the question is just, I think it's just
how does getting angry about someone letting you down relate to compulsive rumination or to rumination in general?
Yeah, I think that rumination is a huge part of, I'm not an anger expert or anything like that, but I think that's a huge part of rumination is absolutely a component. So it's a transdiagnostic process. It's a huge component of it. And I think that when people get really angry about something, the rumination, the function of it is to kind of create that case. It's like, yeah, it makes sense that I'm angry. You know what I mean? Like, here are all the reasons why. And sort of like is fuel for the fire. It's just the question. I just, in terms of the person that's struggling with that, especially if they're struggling with problematic anger, is like, is that workable for you? Is that functional? To go through all that, does that end up making you feel better, or is that actually making the situation worse? So, again, I think it's totally an appropriate treatment target for people who have problems with anger, for sure.
And I like that. I think that almost, when I'm listening to you talk about it, kind of dovetails back to what you were saying earlier about, I know we've talked a little bit of a different topic, but the idea of like rumination and repetitive negative thinking almost being like a protective mechanism for this self-identity kind of.
Definitely.
And that like I can see that in a similar way, that it's almost like I said, justification for feeling angry. So it kind of feels okay to be angry in that moment, where there might be part of you also kind of saying like, all right, like anger isn't helpful in this moment, but then feeling it almost gives that justification. I think in the very same way that it may be protective against, in those case examples you gave.
Exactly. It's very
exposures.
Totally agree.
So with that in mind, do you have any tips for kind of either for individuals that are going through it, or those working with individuals who are going through rumination, maybe kind of stuck in that process of ruminating out loud, or what you found to be most effective to help to disrupt that rumination process?
The first thing is is awareness training, basically. Like, it's developing, and awareness training is something that is a core process in really any good CBT, right? Like, certainly in ERP, certainly in just other types of behavioral interventions. But just developing that simple capacity to understand that, we're trying to talk about a second ago, but that distinction between like, okay, what are the intrusive thoughts, what are the automatic thoughts, all that sort of stuff, and what's where I'm sort of crossing that line. And that can, that takes some kind of deliberate effort on the part of a patient and the clinician to bring some awareness to that. And then it's a question of, once kind of you have more of a sense of, now I'm kind of bitten into it, I actually would look first at the overt behaviors. So I touched on this a little bit, but I'm just going to go with my slide thing a little bit back to my little, this. If you're noticing that you're a big ruminator in response to the intrusive thoughts or the automatic thoughts, literally, what do I tend to be doing when I'm ruminating? Like, have awareness about that. Like I said before, just to reiterate, typically, the behaviors that people are engaging in are behaviors that are conducive to ruminating, if that makes sense. Just like, again, like a ruminating chair, being alone in a room, going on a walk, just like listening to music, but you're just kind of in your head the whole time. You be honest with yourself. When I do this stuff, am I much more likely to engage in all this stuff below? If so, and you start to literally do different behaviors, I'm not saying it's going to turn off the rumination by itself or the repetitive negative, whatever the case might be, but it might make it more difficult. It might be disruptive, kind of. You're asking about kind of disruptive. So, if I feel this way and I instead start engaging socially with people, or engage in something else that is very much a
kind of cognitively demanding exercise, something along those lines.
Yeah.
Maybe making it more difficult to engage in this. And then, so I'd start with overt behaviors actually. And then it's a question of looking at, okay, when I notice that I've been ruminating or worrying, I always wanted to kind of bring people back to this. So it's like, you notice that you're in this what if thing with worrying. You notice that you're chewing on it. You're doing this passively focusing repetitively on symptoms or whatever the case might be. Let's bring it back. What are you avoiding by doing that? What is the again, rumination, repetitive negative thinking I was talking about now. If we think about it as in terms of function, what is the emotional experience that it's serving to keep me from? And I need to go after that emotional experience. I need to, like for me in this case, I had to like practice having the thought, yeah, no, she could die. Like that was scary to have, but I had to sit with that. If I wanted to get over this, want to get past this, I have to just let myself have that, let myself have the anxiety, let myself have whatever it is that shows up, and not and resist engaging in all this sort of stuff. And that's kind of that's a means of decreasing the frequency and the extent to which these are used as a coping strategies. We practice identifying this and facing it.
So it sounds like a kind of a mix of like the cognitive process of raising awareness when it's happening, and then also kind of that behavioral component of almost like opposite action in a sense of like doing something that's incompatible. Exactly. And then for clinicians that may be watching, kind of sounds like a core piece of that is also the functional analysis of like, all right, when is it happening? Looking for that rumination chair, if you will, or that rumination walk, the thing that kind of is tied to it, and then trying to use behavioral strategies to interfere with it, make it hard to ruminate and decrease kind of that pairing. Absolutely. Okay. Well, and so real quickly, also one last question, as I know we're coming up to the end. So one of the questions was, do you know if there's any data on whether or not rumination is stronger in individuals with OCD than struggling with like in the general public, or struggling with other disorders due to kind of like the chemical makeup or neurobiological makeup of OCD? Yeah, I don't know that study's been done. I think rumination, you know why I'm laughing, Nathaniel. I'll give it. Rumination as it occurs in OCD is ill-defined. Let's just say that. I think that we have good measures of rumination for other disorders like OCD, like a depression. There's a good sort of like content-independent measure of rumination out there. But as far as like, I don't know to what extent there's a lot of data that shows that it happens more strongly in OCD than other disorders. Maybe not yet. Not yet. It's not that it doesn't. It's just that we just don't. Yeah, we need to like. I don't know how good we are at measuring it yet in OCD yet. And the studies just haven't been done yet. But anecdotally, it happens awfully strong. I'll say that. All I need to know is that it happens plenty strong in plenty of folks that I work with, and it's worth thinking about. Yeah. Well, I know like this is this conversation that Jason, you and I have had many times of like, how do we measure this effectively, and some of the challenges with it, and what OCD can do to that process. So hopefully, sorry I don't have a great answer for you on that one. Hopefully more to come, but I think it's a wonderful research question that I know many people are chasing down. So with that, I did just want to say, Jason, thank you so much for joining.